Hi, my name's Mark, one of the pastors at Trillium. About a week ago, my wife Sally and I were watching a TV program, and when it was over, she was tired. She said, I'm going to bed. And I said to her, yeah, I'm going to be coming along right behind you. And she looked at me with a bit of skepticism, of disbelief. Yeah, right. You see, I have a pattern, a history of delaying my coming to bed. You see, I find interesting things along the way. Sometimes I even get a stimulation of energy, of interest in things, and I get delayed so that my time of coming to bed is much later than when I said I was coming. And so she doesn't really believe my words in that part of our life. Now, I'm grateful that Sally trusts other parts of my word in life, so to speak, that she trusts when I commit to things that I will fulfill them. Otherwise, I think our marriage would be in very grave difficulty. In fact, every relationship that's important to us rests on the trust in our promises to each other, our commitments, our word. When we make a commitment to somebody, when we make a promise to them, there's this notion that we're going to fulfill what we say we're going to do. If we don't, it's going to spill over into our relationships in a very negative way. There's lots of quotes online about promises, which tells me that promise making and promise keeping are an important part of the human experience. See, I have a friend of mine who rarely keeps his promises. He makes them, but he rarely follows through and keeps them. You see, I think deep down he believes that promise making is a one-step process. You just make the promise, but the keeping of the promise is not part of his thinking. And we know, most of us, that promises are rooted in a two-step process: the making of the promise and the keeping of the promise. Our willingness to be bound by our word. Bound by it. There's a wonderful quote online. It goes like this: don't make promises you don't intend to keep. You probably heard that before, I imagine. It's a very famous quote on promises. Don't make promises you don't intend to keep. That is, the follow-through is a critical element of the whole promise-making, promise-keeping experience. If you don't intend to be bound by your word, then just don't make it. And I suppose it rests in an experience that many of us do have in a common way, that promises are often not carried through, and we're left, in a sense, holding the bag. The Bible is a book about promises. There are some critical promises made in the Bible. In fact, we have the Old Testament and the New Testament in the Christian Bible. Testament is just another word for covenant. So we have an Old Covenant and a New Covenant. But covenant is really just another word for a promise. It's a promise made between God and a person, or God and a people. And so we have the promise God makes to Noah in the book of Genesis. We have the promise that God makes to Israel through Moses in Exodus. We have the promise that God makes to David, King David, through the prophet Nathan in 2 Samuel. We have the new promise, the new covenant made in the book of Jeremiah. We even have a promise of a sort made to Jesus, and through Jesus to us in the New Testament. One of the most important of the promises, the covenants that's made in the Old Testament, is the one between God and Abraham. See, God makes a special promise to Abraham that he's going to be the father of many people. This is consistently reiterated in the book of Genesis many times over and over again. God saying to Abraham, I'm going to make you a father of many people. And so the years go by, and Abraham and his wife Sarah have no children. The decades go by until Abraham and Sarah are now really old. Sarah is no longer able to have children. And Abraham's an old man. And still there's no heir for them. And Abraham starts to wonder, how am I supposed to be a father of many nations if I have no children? And the underlying question that's being asked and answered in the Bible as a whole and in the story of Abraham is, does God make promises that God does not intend to keep? And in the story of Abraham, we see Abraham's trust and confidence in God and God's willingness to carry through the promise pushed out decade after decade, until finally, when Abraham's 100 years old and Sarah, his wife, is completely sterile, in that moment she conceives and has a son. And even then, the journey towards this promise being fulfilled goes through many twists and turns, until ultimately in Genesis 23, Abraham is given the final blessing. You'll be a father of many nations. And of course, the story carries forward, and it's in fact what happens. But not in any way that Abraham would ever have anticipated. And this story is looked back at by the New Testament writers and looked at as a way of lifting up the power of our faith and trust in God's promises. And we see the promise that God makes to Jesus. You are my beloved Son in whom I'm pleased. And the promise that lives out through Jesus as he carries forward in faith and trust God's promise to bless and bring life. And this carries Jesus on so many different twists and turns until ultimately he makes the odd, unpredictable journey to the cross and to death, and then finally to resurrection. The New Testament writers want us to focus on this feature, that God never makes a promise that God will not fulfill, but sometimes the promises are fulfilled in ways that we cannot anticipate, in a manner that we would not completely understand at the front end. And the promise given to us, the encouragement in the promise, is to keep going to the end of the story. Make sure you go right to the very end, because often that is the very place where God will fulfill his promises. So no matter what you and I are dealing with today, whatever we're up against, whatever struggle we have, the encouragement in both the Old Testament and the New Testament is to go to the very end and trust that no matter where along the way God chooses to act, somewhere along the way, even at the very end, God will fulfill the promises he has made to you and me.